Okay, so for homework, first we'll do the website examples. The first one is x plus y. You can see it. You don't need me to tell it to you. So the first step is to make a matrix, a 3x4 matrix made up of the constants from each equation. And then the goal is to end up with a matrix that looks like this. 1, 0, 0, and some number, 0, 1, 0, and a number, 0, 0, 1, and a number, in which this first one is the coefficient of x, this one here is the coefficient of y, and this one is the coefficient of z. And then the number at the end is what each of them equals. Okay, so on the right here are my row operations, and they refer to the rows above. So this R1 refers to this row, this R1 refers to this row, right here, and so on. So you can just see what I'm doing. Since row 1 already has a 1 in it, I'm going to take it, so I'm going to start with that. My goal at this first level is to get a 1, 0, 0, to get the first column to match my ultimate goal here, okay, which is not hard to do. So I already got a 1 in the first row, so I just bring down row 1. Now to get a 0 in the second row, I'm going to take negative 2 times R3, right here, and combine it with R2. And then to get a 0, to zero out this number here, the 2, I'm going to take negative 2 times R1, so I'll make that a negative 2, and combine it with R3, and then I get this row here. I'm sorry, I take negative 2 times R1 and combine it with R3. That's a typo. Okay. Next, I'm sticking with R1. I haven't done anything to R1 yet. I take R2 I gotta pause this. Yeah, okay, so I took this R2 and divided it by 1/2, by negative 1/2. Okay, so I took this row and divided by negative 1/2. Right, okay, that gives me this row here. And finally, I took 5 times R2 minus 2 times R1, and that gives me this row right here. Okay, moving on. All right. I take R1 minus R2. That gives me this row here. This is R2 from above. And this is simply R3 times 1 over negative 24, which gives me 1 and negative 2. So now I know what Z equals. Z equals negative 2. Now that I have Z equals, I have 1 and a negative 2 on the bottom row, then I can use this to finish everything off. So I take R1 plus R3, and that knocks out that negative 1, and that gives me 1007. That's what X equals. And then I take R2 minus 2 R3, and that gives me 001, negative 2. Example 2 is more of the same. I make the 3x4 matrix, and then I start my row operations. Row 1, I take R1 plus R3, R1 times R3, and then I multiply that by 1/3. R1 plus R3, and multiply that by 1/3. Okay. And then R2 times 2R3. So that gives me 1, 0, 0, the first column. Next, R1 minus R2. R1 minus R2. It's right here. R1 minus R2 gives me this row right here. This is simply R2. Notice R2 is finished. We have y equals 2. And then I take R2 minus R3, and that gives me what z equals. Z equals -3. And then I use R1 minus R3 to finish off row 1, and there are my answers. And then we got more. System of 3 equations. Make the 3x4 matrix. Fill in zeros where they happen to fall. I take row 1 as it is. Row 2 minus 3R1. That gives me a 0. R3 minus 2R1. R3 minus 2R1, that gives me a 0 there. So I got my 1, 0, 0. Next, my next move is always, I want to end at this level with, z effectively being solved. So I just take R1 and R2 from the rows above. But I'm going to take R3 minus 2R2, and that zeroes out the 2 here. And that gives me 0, 0, -7, -14. I take R1, R2, take R3 divided by -7. That gives me 1 and 2. Now I can use R3 to clean out and finish off the 2 equations above. R1 plus 3R3, R2 minus 7R3. 64. It's more of the same. This first row, R3 minus 3R1. Yeah, right, that gives me a 1. R3 minus 3R1, that gives me 1, -2. Okay, R2, I take it as it is because I got a 0. And this is, I'm going to take R3 minus R2. That's going to leave me with a 7 here. So I don't get a 0 here. Okay. Now, I take first R1, R2 from above. I take R3 minus 7R1. That gives me a 0 here. R3 minus 7R1 gives me a 0. Okay. All right. Next, R1 plus R2 gives me a 1, 0, -10. R3 minus 3R2. R3 minus 3R2. And finally, I just put R2 down here because it's got the 0 and I like this. Okay. R1, R2, and minus 2R2 plus R3. Minus 2R2 plus R3 gives me 0, 0, -135, -810. Okay, I just take R1, R2, and R3 divided by -135 gives me a 1 and a 6. So the bottom row is done, and I'm going to use this to finish off everything above it. So R3 times 10 plus R1, R3 times 10 plus R1 takes care of that. R2 plus R3 times negative 67. R2 plus R3 times negative 67 gives me a 0 here. So I'm done. 8, 10, and 6. Okay, and then 67 is the last one. Okay. I take R1. Oh, this is R1 times negative 1. Okay, R1 times negative 1. R2 plus 2R1, okay. And R3 plus 3R1. Great, okay, 1, 0, 0. So far, so good. R1 plus R2, R1 plus R2, 1, 0. So now, first row is done, x equals 7. R2, I'm just bringing down R2, and then R3 minus 5R2. R3 minus 5R2 gives me a 0 here. 3 and 12. Actually, bring down R1, R2, and then I got R3 divided by 3. That gives me 1 and a 4. R3 divided by 3. Okay. And then I use R3 to finish off R2. R1, I just bring down. I take R2 plus R3, gives me a 0 here. So I got the 7, -3, and 4 for x, y, and z, and that's it.